Okay, well, I will go ahead and get started. Good morning, afternoon, maybe it's even evening somewhere for the attendees. So I'm Stephanie Holmgren. I'm in the Office of Data Science at the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, or NIEHS for short. And NIEHS is fostering this initiative. A little bit more about that in a moment. I'm actually going to begin slide sharing right now, so hopefully we will hopefully you are now seeing the full slides. Actually, I want to do one thing. Apologies. I want to go ahead and stop my camera so that you don't have to worry about seeing me for right now. So I will be back. Can you confirm you see the first slide?
It's showing your notes window.
Showing the notes window. Okay.
Perfect.
Yep.
Great. All right. So a little bit of logistics. I'm sure you're all old hats at this, but just as a reminder, you can expand the presentation screen by using that square box in the bottom right-hand panel of the screen you're interested in expanding. Jess has hopefully now put into the chat box the Google Collaboration document, so please sign in as an attendee. There's also additional information in that Google Doc. Please use the chat to introduce yourself and share your comments, and we ask that you use the Q&A box for specific questions that you have for the presenters or about the community. That way it's easier for Jess to keep track of the questions coming in. And we ask that you keep yourselves muted, and of course the presentation is being recorded. So welcome everybody to the Birds of a Feather session to propose an interest group on enhancing the semantic interoperability of environmental health sciences research. As a quick reminder of today's agenda, so our session will lead off with several presentations to provide background on the nature of EHS research, followed by 4 presentations on the value that using a standard language can bring to environmental health research. We will have a very brief Q&A before I present the mission, goals, and activities for this proposed RDA interest group. And then afterwards, the floor will be open for discussion and next steps. So the intent of this session really is threefold. We want to assess RDA member interest in this topic and obtain input on the proposed charter for the interest group. And we finally want to understand how this interest group can interface with related RDA efforts. To provide context on why this initiative is being proposed, Dr. Gwen Coleman will start us off by describing the nature of environmental health sciences research and its associated semantic challenges. Dr. Coleman is currently the acting deputy director of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. Previously, she was the director of the NIEHS Division of Extramural Research and Training, where for 11 years, she oversaw the program administration of more than 1,000 active grants, including programs such as the Cheer Here Exposure Resource, which you will be hearing about, the Target Consortium, Gulf Oil Spill, the Translational Research Framework, and many more. Over to you, Dr. Coleman.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much, Stephanie, for that introduction. I'm really excited to be here today. If you can go to the next slide, Stephanie, that would be great. NIEHS, of course, is the part of the NIH that's focused on environmental health. And throughout our research community, we're using many kinds of data from many sources and different types and different utilities for that data. And so I want to give you some background on that as we go. This slide shows our beautiful campus in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina, and the mission of our institute. Next slide, please. So when we think about environment at NIEHS, we think about a broad number of areas, pretty much anything not genetic, but of particular interest is the chemical environment and other sources of pollution or toxicants in our world. Next slide, please. Now, when we think about these intertwining parts of our environment, we have created collectively with researchers around the world the concept of the exposome. And here we're talking about all the totality of environmental exposures that one faces from the moment of conception through gestation, at birth, through childhood, all the way through our adult lifetime till elderly, frail elderly time period. There's several different groups of exposures to think about. If you think about the ecosystem or about how our built environment affects us, you see there's a circle on the top that lists many of those concepts. We can think about lifestyle, diet, physical activity, smoking, alcohol use. Those are routinely used in almost every population study that is on any of the health outcomes. The social determinants of health are particularly important because they really impact how communities and populations are exposed to our physical and chemical environment and our built environment. So we have data that comes in different ways about inequalities that people are exposed to. And this very long list of the physical and chemical environment really shows you the variety and scope of chemical sources in our air, in our water, and throughout our lifetime. Next slide, please. So we like to think about how we document these exposures and where we get the data from. And I started before saying that the chemical exposures are found in our air, water, soil, consumer products, different medications. We have different classes of compounds, physical, chemical, biological compounds. They target multiple organ systems and the entire body. Where do we find these exposures? Well, everywhere you can think of. Where we live, where we go to school, where we work, where we pray, where we recreate, out in nature as well. And how do they get into our bodies? Well, through our lungs, through our skin, through our diet, many different pathways for exposure. And again, the concept of the totality of exposure or the exposome really looks at that time, the windows of susceptibility, both for when exposures occur and the susceptibilities for when we would see the health outcomes associated with those. The pyramid here shows you the multi-stage, multi-layers, multi-levels of exposure from everything from our global ecosystem to the community, neighborhood, built environment in our local environments, populations, both large groups of people as well as individuals. And then when you get internal into our bodies, you see exposures all the way to the cellular level. Next slide, please. So again, if you think about the diverse data types that an environmental health science team would be handling in any research, it goes from the most molecular all the way to the highest population level. And the sources of data are from electronic health records or self-report questionnaire data, geospatial data, and administrative databases, imaging pictures for pathology or other kinds of clinical devices that generate images. We have metabolic data, phenotypic data. We can collect data from environmental sensors and monitors, as well as personal monitoring. And we have toxicity data on the bioavailability and bioactivity of these chemicals that are in our environment. So many different types and so many different challenges in how to utilize and synergize and integrate all of these data streams in our research projects. Next slide, please. So, and then there's the group of people who are using this data. So there are researchers who are generating data. There are scientists who are using the data in analysis projects. And there are end users of the data, policymakers, regulators, the general public. And we see that we, on our teams in environmental health, we have a diversity of disciplines represented people who have special skills in social sciences, in toxicology, in clinical sciences, epidemiology, and the like, in order to tackle the complex questions that face us when we think about the health effects of environmental hazards. Next slide, please. And here's just a few examples of the people who are at the table or in the research and translational spheres of the world of environmental health. And these are some of the questions that they are asking of the data and how they are looking at the data through their unique lenses. When we think about how we want to talk about the data, we want to make sure that everybody understands what data means, what the variables mean, how data are collected, making sure that people in all of the different disciplines that I mentioned before are using a common vocabulary and have a clear understanding of, when you talk about a toxic chemical or a health outcome, that everybody has the same understanding of the meaning of the points that we're trying to look at. Next slide. So in summary, I want to say that in general, the field of environmental health sciences, with all of our data needs and our data practitioners, we're really looking to move the field forward using a community-endorsed set of best practices. As I said, making sure that everybody really understands the data and has an ability to use it from whatever vantage point they are interested in. We want to break down the current silos. We want to support common infrastructure, and we really want to make sure that we can interconnect all of the data and resource ecosystems that we know are out there. Now, this has been going on for some time, although I would say that the field of environmental health doesn't have a single way to characterize this. We are building on the shoulders of past or existing ontology work in programs like HERE, ENVO, ECTO, and EXO, and there are other similar efforts in things like genetics or molecular biology, where our health endpoints or our biological endpoints are standardized using current vocabularies. We really want to, capitalize on the NIH sharing mandates. We want to promote fair data management and sharing principles. We want to be able to use and reuse data that NIH has invested in and NIEHS sees as important building blocks to answer future questions and maybe even make predictions using data sets. And of course, now we're in an exciting time because we want to catalyze the knowledge-driven discovery by facilitating artificial intelligence and machine learning approaches. So lots to do, and I think this session will help us start to bring all of the members of our vast communities together to create the data ecosystem necessary, again, to address very important new discoveries and new ways of building upon our data investments of the past. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Gwen. For time purposes, I'm going to introduce our first two speakers, and then after they have finished, I will introduce the next two. So I'm now pleased to introduce Drs. Edwards and Pan, who will share their experiences developing and applying semantic approaches to enable their areas of environmental health sciences research. Starting us off is Dr. Stephen Edwards, a bioinformatics senior scientist within the Genomics, Bioinformatics, and Translational Research Center at RTI International in Research Triangle Park. His current research examines the combined impact of genetic and environmental factors on disease manifestation to better support both precision medicine and public health protection. Prior to joining RTI, Dr. Edwards worked for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, where he used computational approaches to describe the mechanisms by which chemicals cause disease and thereby aid the interpretation of high-throughput toxicity test results. Dr. William Pan, our second speaker, is the Elizabeth Brooks Reed and Wyatt Law Reed Associate Professor of Population Studies and Global Environmental Health in the Nicholas School of Environment and Duke Global Health Institute at Duke University. He is a biostatistician trained in infectious disease epidemiology, demography, and land change science. His research focuses on population health and environment dynamics, primarily in low and middle income countries. Steve, we look forward to learning about AOPs. And
thank you, Stephanie.
There we go. All right.
Okay, and I think you can go on to the next slide. So the focus of my talk today is going to be on connecting in vitro assays and basically a transition from traditional in vivo toxicology studies that focused on apical endpoints to in vitro toxicity testing that can be cheaper, faster, and results in less animal suffering, but comes at a cost, and that is that the in vivo studies, which are focused on the right-hand side of the screen with the adverse outcomes, already encapsulate a lot of the complicating factors and give you the answer that you want. Whereas the in vitro tests tend to focus on the left-hand side of this screen, and so they're looking at molecular and cellular perturbations. And in order for us to interpret what an active means in these assays, we need to understand the process by which those early stage perturbations result in the endpoints over on the right. And so the adverse outcome pathway framework was developed specifically to answer that question. And so we have a series of key events that are basically the steps needed to translate from the left-hand side to the right-hand side. And if we go to the next slide, but then, you know, the process is a bit more complicated than that. And anyone that works in biology knows that a single linear pathway from one particular molecular perturbation to an adverse outcome is overly simplistic. And biology has a lot more, there's a lot more inputs and feedbacks and lots of things going on. And so from the very beginning, we knew that individual AOPs would not be useful. They're a useful construct for defining the toxicity because they bound the problem, but they're not a useful construct for interpreting. And so we wanted a way to allow people to define these individual AOPs, but then for them to naturally come together and form this AOP network that you see on the right, which is a bit closer to the actual biological complexity. And so this required some design decisions to kind of help facilitate that process. And so on the next slide, we talk about, you know, one of the design decisions, and that was that we pushed really early for a centralized knowledge base to capture all of this information. And so we stood up an AOP wiki early in the initiative. The information in the wiki, so authors around the world had access to the wiki, could put their information directly into the wiki, and then that information is immediately accessible by anyone in the world. The website, we have an API that allows dynamic programmatic access of the data, and we also do nightly XML dumps. So if you want to build a system that incorporates the AOP data, you can download that nightly and have it locally in your system. And we've built around that wiki. We've got several other modules in the knowledge base, as well as some third-party tools that build off the knowledge base now. But it was really important early on to get this out there. And then the next slide shows the second thing that we really pushed for, and that is an ontological basis to make the AOP descriptions as computable and interoperable as we could. And so we intentionally did not want to reinvent the wheel, so we put together a very slim AOP ontology, which is shown on the top of this slide in the red boxes, which essentially just capture those components that I showed you on the first slide, which are our key events. So the things that we can actually see happening as things progress from an early stage chemical interaction to a late stage adverse impact, and key event relationships that highlight the causal relationships between those key events. And then what we did is we described our key events themselves in terms of entities from existing biological ontologies. And those are the boxes shown in green towards the bottom of the slide. And so, you know, the goal here was to develop something that described things in the way that we needed them described for our AOP framework, but to leverage to the greatest extent, existing reference ontologies for interoperability, both within our system, but also with other systems. And then you can go to the next slide. There were many challenges with this project, but I've boiled down the ones to discuss today down to just 3. And the first challenge we had was we had a push and a pull of in order to get adoption of this knowledge base, we needed to get it out quickly before all the different players kind of develop their own systems for putting AOP information together and storing it. So where there was a time sensitivity on getting the system built. But as anyone who's ever worked with ontologies or even more developed ontologies knows, that's a very time consuming process. And so we ended up having to move those two in parallel. And we just tried to design the system in such a way that we can incorporate the ontology work as it came on board. And it also involved a lot of iterative and agile development on the system. Now that we have a mature system, that challenge is pretty much gone, and we can be a lot more thoughtful now in how we modify the system moving forward. The second challenge was building a community. And there we got a little bit lucky in that our effort spun off of a larger effort within the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development to facilitate the use of these in vitro toxicity tests. And so we had a lot of people who had a vested interest in seeing this through and were very active. That said, if we go to the next slide, the community building part is still a challenge. And our original vision, hence the name AOP Wiki, was really to push for crowdsourcing of this information, and with the hope being that academics and other experts in the different areas of biology would contribute their knowledge. And then when the risk assessment scientist or the regulator came to actually do the regulations, they would already have that information assembled by experts that they could consume. And that vision is still to be realized. The last challenge, which is still very acute, and that is, I mentioned, some of the trade-offs we did with our ontology development and reuse, trying to balance between our application needs, which are, almost assuredly going to be different from the needs of the people who developed the other ontologies to begin with. And how do you balance between reusing ontologies and meeting your application needs? And that's an ongoing effort, and we spend a lot of time collaborating. We're working with folks from the GO Consortium now who have developed this idea of a causal activity model. We're collaborating with folks from NIEHS who are doing similar things. And so it really requires constant collaboration and diligence to make sure you don't end up in a silo. And I think the last slide is just to say thank you for letting me speak, and I'll be happy to take questions at the end.
Thank you, Steve. And Bill, whenever you're ready.
Thank you. That's really useful to listen to, and I think there's a lot of parallels to what Stephen was just saying and things that I'm going to be presenting. You can go to the next slide. So a lot of the work that I'm going to be talking about are motivated by 2 questions that I've been working on roughly for the past 10 or 15 years, and they are the first is to develop, validate, and implement a malaria early warning system for the Amazon, and the second really deals with the idea of identifying, testing technologies, interventions, and behavior changes that are necessary to reduce mercury pollution or the impacts of mercury exposure from artisanal and small-scale gold mining. These projects and the things I'm going to be talking about are not going to be, I'm not going to get into details. I'm kind of giving you lessons learned from these projects. But I do want to give you a little bit of taste on what I'm actually doing in both of these. So go to the next slide, please. So in the early warning system project, I'm sure everybody knows that malaria is a vector-borne disease. It's spread by a bite of an Anopheline mosquito between humans, there's roughly 4 Plasmodium species. There's actually a 5th, but 4 that primarily cause human infection. And malaria is a risk in over 100 countries with 3.5 to 4 billion people at risk. And what we have done is create an early warning system with support from NASA, as well as we have a pending approval of an R01 coming from NIH, where we have taken Earth observation data, which essentially are satellite images, as well as other types of remote sensing data, human enumeration for population, and then government surveillance data, and created different types of modeling systems using that information. Something we call a land data assimilation system, which provides on-the-ground climate information, an ecological niche model, which provides land use and land cover, biodiversity and other kind of topography data, a human population model, and then as well as the government malaria surveillance data. All of that's combined in a very complex way to produce multiple models. We have something called an eco-region model, a district forecast model, and an agent-based models. And the end result of this has been that we've validated the model in Loreto, Peru, which is the largest Amazon region of the Peruvian Amazon, where we have greater than 90% sensitivity and greater than 90% specificity in detecting malaria outbreaks 12 weeks in advance. You can go to the next slide. The second research question that motivates some of our thinking is this work that we're doing on artisanal gold mining. And you can go forward, actually, it's an animated slide. So if you are unfamiliar with gold mining, which I was before I really started this project, you probably did not know that roughly 20 to 30% of global gold supply comes from artisanal scale gold mining. And you probably also didn't know, which I didn't, that artisanal small scale gold mining is the leading source of global mercury pollution into the atmosphere. And other things that happen in the Amazon, which motivated this research initially, was that gold mining is the leading cause of deforestation in some parts of the Amazon. And then, of course, exposure to mercury can cause many health problems, most importantly, some irreversible neurological impairment. So how does mercury get into the environment during the excavation process, which results in massive deforestation? So the picture you see on the left used to be a lush tropical forest in the Peruvian Amazon. It gets converted to a desert. Miners take the soil, and this is an alluvial soil, an alluvial mining operation. It's different if you're in the Andes or other types of locations, but the soil is mixed into a slurry, and there's different gravimetric techniques that are used. Mercury is combined with that slurry because it amalgamates or combines with gold to form a little rock amalgamation, and that amalgamation is then burned. The burning results in gold as a byproduct that's left over, but because mercury has a very low boiling point, you can actually burn it away and it goes straight into the atmosphere. So mercury enters the environment both from the excavation process when you deforest a landscape through erosion. It enters from the tailings or the waste that's produced during the mixturing process, and then it results also from the burning the emissions. Eventually, mercury cycles into the atmosphere or into the terrestrial environment, moves into aquatic ecosystems, and can bioaccumulate in the food chain as methyl mercury, which is a very poisonous substance. You can go to the next slide. So we've done a lot of thinking on how to combine land cover, climate data, and health data in different contexts. And I've written a lot about this, and most of the things that I'm going to be talking about are found in a lot of the things that are already published. The first one was with a colleague of mine, Joe Messina, on different ontologies between land change science and health. But most recently is an article with Mike Wimberly, where we talk about satellite observations in malaria and how they can be used for doing malaria research. We have 2 other chapter books coming out, the 2 bottom ones, which are in population books, both the land use change and health, as well as the population dynamics and the environment chapter that should be coming out in the next month or 2. Go to the next slide. So based on this work, the things that we have recognized as the most important challenges, there's about 3 or 4 of them. The first one is moving from a conceptual model to a theory of change. So I'm hoping everyone knows what a theory of change is, because I don't want to get into that too much. But when you look at conceptual models, a lot of times you could see, say, in the IPCC or with WHO, the IPBES, some of the conceptual models are not complete. They might cut off certain drivers of linking land use to human risk, or climate to human risk, or it might ignore the health outcomes and the feedbacks between health outcomes and human behavior. But moving from a conceptual model to theory of change, you have to first start by having a correct conceptual model. And then the challenge comes to what is actually going to be measured in your theory of change. Not only what gets measured, but what scale are you measuring these things? What are you considering a direct versus an underlying driver? And what are the assumptions and limitations in your theory of change that might threaten how the causal relationships are conceived? You go to the next slide. Another important major challenge, which is what Joe and I first wrote about in 2014, is this idea of spatial scale. I know I mentioned this in the last slide, but this cannot be stressed enough. In land use science, usually what happens, and this is true in climate science, you are producing data products that are spatially continuous and usually temporally continuous as well. But in epidemiology, what we do is we deal with discrete outcomes and discrete spatial scales and discrete time scales to classify risk. And when you combine these two different approaches to conceptualizing data and relationships, you can end up with ecological fallacies. You can end up with a disconnect between the environmental characteristic and what's occurring to a person's health. You can go to the next slide. In the article with Mike Wimberly, we highlighted this in the availability of satellite data, looking at different satellite products that are provided by, for example, NASA or the EU Space Center or Japan, and what those satellites can monitor and how you can use them for things like monitoring climate, looking at mosquito habitats, how humans and land are being used. And if you go to the next slide, we provide an assessment of the scale at which satellite images can be used to monitor things. So both the spatial resolution of the data as well as the temporal resolution. And then you have to link back how these spatial, I'm not sure if I would call them limitations, but these are the designations of the scale for space and time, how they map back onto the epidemiology of malaria. Now, this is true not just for malaria, but it can be true for virtually anything that you're monitoring, including mercury, because we have also research where we try to do hydrological models to predict how mercury flows from a deforested landscape in gold mining to different types of communities downstream. And the scale at which you collect data can really influence the inference that you're making. You can go to the next slide.
Dr. Pan, this is your 1-minute warning.
Sure. Yeah, I just have one more slide after this. So the other major challenge is just terminology across disciplines. Now, there's a lot of challenges with terminology that I come up with. The one that was most recent is this idea of the difference between migration and travel. So I showed 3 different articles here that are talking about movement of people and how it's related to malaria. And I got into a debate very recently about how malariologists wanted to use the word travel to conceptualize how people are moving across a landscape. But I reminded them that definition of movement is actually owned by demographers. And we can't change the language of calling something a migration event versus a travel event. And I think that it's very important to keep definition within discipline. You can go to the last slide. So just to say, in my opinion, if we are moving forward and trying to figure out how to combine things in an ontological way, and land, climate, and epidemiology, the most important thing is scale. We need to match these scales. We need to start testing how different scales are interacting. And we need to think about mixtures of scales. And that has a correlation, some of the mercury work that. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Bill. And up next is Dr. Jeanette Stenjoni, an environmental epidemiologist at Columbia University Medical Center with a focus on pregnancy as a vulnerable exposure period. Her current research combines data science techniques with more traditional epidemiologic methods to investigate health effects associated with complex environmental mixtures and multiple exposures. This includes advancing the reuse of existing data through novel data linkages and harmonization, adapting machine learning analytic techniques to account for the specific challenges of multiple exposures, and promoting data sharing and interoperability using ontologies and semantic science. And our final speaker, Dr. Morris Swartz, a full professor of bioinformatics at the University Medical Center Groningen in the Netherlands, where he is head of UMCG's Genomic Coordination Center. In addition, he holds a fascinating title, Chair, Fair Big Data in Biomedicine. Not surprisingly then, he strives to make all scientific data and non-data freely available and open source. And because scientific data verification and integration cannot be done alone, he spends much of his time leading and coordinating data in large international consortia, including the recently becoming co-chair of the European Health Exposome Network's Metadata Working Group. Jeanette, whenever you're ready.
Great, thank you. Stephanie, do you think you can hit the hide button on the bottom of the screen? I just, for the sharing thing, I don't know if it's possible. If not, no worries.
Let's see.
I don't know if you can see it on your screen. It says it's sharing the screen, and
I can, unfortunately.
Don't worry about it. It's totally not a big deal.
Not allowing me to get onto the second monitor for some reason.
Yeah, don't worry about it. It's fine. I don't think it'll block anything. So you could just go right to the next slide then. Thank you.
Okay.
So I'm going to be talking about the HERE data center today and what we do that involves ontologies and sort of what our remaining challenges are, and why we sort of need this community of focused on environmental health standardization and common vocabularies. So,
sorry.
Okay,
because I clicked hide, actually, it totally closed me out.
No, there we go. Thank you. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cause problems.
No worries.
That's what I do. So Stephen's laughing. He knows. Okay, so I'm going to start out briefly talking about what is the HERE data center, the challenges of working with other people's data, how we're using ontologies to facilitate data harmonization across different studies, and then some of the challenges we face, particularly in knowledge modeling. So if we could go to the next slide. So very briefly, HERE stands for the Human Health Exposure Analysis Resource. This is an infrastructure that is funded by the US-based National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences. And basically what it means is if you have a study that was funded by NIH and you have banked biospecimen, you can come into the HERE program and your biospecimen will be analyzed for environmental exposures. As of now, if you have environmental samples, those also could be analyzed. And that happens supported by this infrastructure. And then those data can be used to answer, any research questions that you may have. And so that's where the laboratory network comes in. The data center helps you analyze those data that are produced by the lab network. And the other thing the data center does a lot, but for purposes of time, what I'm going to focus on today is the other piece of the data center, which is the data repository. All of the data that are produced by the HERE network get deposited and are made available more broadly to the scientific community. Next slide. And so as you can see here on this slide, the HERE data center has multiple pieces. What I'm going to focus on today is this repository, right? The purpose of this repository is to take the data generated by HERE, that includes both the exposure data and analysis, as well as the phenotypic data of the study participants, and make it available to the scientific community in a way that it is usable and of benefit to the community. So I want you to think about this. These studies, the only thing that links them together is that they have to be funded by NIH, and they have to have biospecimen or environmental samples. So these are really diverse studies, everything from pregnancy cohorts to studies of cancer. There's no prior coordination. The other thing is that studies can apply to be part of the HERE network as we go along. So this is a dynamic and growing resource. And so because of that, our harmonization has to really be prospective and really just sort of be ready for whatever is coming down the pike towards us. But the cool part, right, is that we've got this potential to pool these data and address really important scientific questions. So the question that we focus on in the data center is, how do we harmonize these disparate study data? And I think Gwen did a really great job of explaining the type, the breadth and depth of the types of data we see in environmental health studies. But also, can machines do the labor for us, right? As anyone who's done pooled analysis, figuring out somebody's var1 is equal to somebody else's age _ mom is awful, right? Can computers do that for us? And that's really the challenge we face in the HERE data center. Next slide. So the first challenge is just insufficient metadata. In epidemiology and environmental health, we use data dictionaries to describe our data. But how well we do that is very up in the air. This is just 2 examples from 2 different studies. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just to show what you can see from looking at these just brief examples is that the information we need is often split among different fields. So for example, if you look under pregnancy study, here we have an informative variable name of % body fat. The description measures from DXA. Now, I know that that's DEXA, but I don't know who this is about. If I just looked at the description, I would have no idea what the measure was. And so again, we focus, because this is what we use, on human readable. But the idea of making things machine readable means that we need a lot more standardization. Next slide. And that gets us to this, our second challenge, which I think is really relevant for today, is this lack of standardization and common vocabularies across studies. So this is an example of just maternal education during pregnancy. Education in the United States is extremely standardized. And yet, as epidemiologists, we still find a way to sort of put our own spin on everything. So this is just 3 examples on this slide. You can see they have different variable names, which is expected, sometimes informative, sometimes not. But even in the labels that we use, right? So for example, if someone is a college graduate, they have a college degree. Now, I know that as a human, and if I'm trying to harmonize these 3 studies, I might be able to say, yes, these are equivalent. But wouldn't it be better if we just had a single term? And so that's how we are using ontologies. Next slide. So the first thing that we use ontologies for is we go through everyone's data dictionaries and we map investigator terms to standardized vocabularies. So not only are they the same, but then they're also understood by both humans and machines. Because remember, if you're only pooling 3 studies, maybe humans, it's laborious, but if you find a grad student, and I was one of those grad students, maybe it's not so bad. But when we're on the order of 30, 40, 50 studies, we really want computers to do some of this heavy lifting for us. The second thing is we represent both explicit and implicit metadata so that we know who the variables are about, when, the time period, and having this sort of standardized representation of what the data values mean. And then the last thing we do, and I'll be going into more detail on all of these, is to leverage semantic technologies so that machines can perform some of these tasks for us related to harmonization, and we can really sort of get the full power of using these standards. So next slide. So the first thing we did is we created the HERE ontology, which I guess you could think of as an application ontology because it's designed to represent the knowledge within HERE studies. And again, I think Gwen did a really great job of talking about the breadth and depth of what that entails in environmental health. We start out with some foundational ontologies, as you can see on this slide, and then we use other ontologies for specific concepts that we need. KEBI, the disease ontology, Uberon. And this is one of the challenges I'm going to talk about later. Who decides what terms we use and why? I think I'm pretty smart, but I don't think I should be making the decisions for everyone. And I think that's one of the reasons why we really need community. Next slide. And so again, HERE ontology provides a standardized vocabulary. You can find it on BioPortal if you're interested to sort of see how we've sort of assembled these terms to represent the knowledge within the studies. Next slide. And so how do we do this mapping? So we've published a paper that's in Data Intelligence on the use of what we're calling semantic data dictionaries. This was led by a graduate student at RPI, Sabir Rashid. And what we do is we take the information from the data dictionaries and then we really map it out. What is it? who is it about, what is the implicit object that this is describing, all using standardized terms from ontologies. And this is what allows us to take our human readable data dictionaries and translate them into something that is machine readable, and then allows us to sort of represent this data in knowledge graphs. If you could go to the next slide. I'm not going to talk a lot about this knowledge graph, just to show that we're transforming our data into knowledge graphs. And then if you could go to the next slide. And this is what powers our repository. So if you are interested, you can go to the HERE Data Center website. You can get an account. You sign a data use agreement, of course, and you can access these data that have been harmonized to a common vocabulary. And you can search by a lot of different features. You can search by the studies themselves. We have 2 different search features, and I'm happy to talk about that more in the questions if people are interested. Next slide. And then this also enables us that you can download these data, and they are now customized data sets harmonized to a common vocabulary. So in the most basic example that we have, multiple studies with biological sex. We have a single column name, right, which tells you exactly what it is, the same codes across studies for, in this case, just male and female. But thinking about that, expanded out, that doesn't seem so impressive, right? This is just a 2-category variable. But expanding out to all of our variables so that when you download the data, a lot of the work is done for you. You don't need to figure out var1, var5, age. And so this is all possible with our repository. Next slide. But our challenges. So as I mentioned before, the prioritization of different ontologies. What should we use? Is it going to vary, and it will vary based on the application? How do we deal with that within the HERE data repository as we're trying to meet the needs of the broad scientific community? The modeling of complex concepts. It's easy to represent maternal age during pregnancy, but what about days with activity limitations due to asthma in the past 2 weeks? We still have a lot of manual labor needed to map these terms. And so thinking about how do we better use machines to automate some of this is another challenge. And then finally, encouraging our community to use common data elements and improve metadata. I think, again, this really gets to why we need community, getting people to buy into this and think about, okay, how do I better represent my historical data and the data I'm collecting now so it can be better used by others? Next slide. So I just want to acknowledge the HERE Data Center. It is led by Mount Sinai. Susan Teitelbaum is our PI in collaboration with Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and of course our support from NIEHS. If you want more information, there's our website, and thank you.
Thank you, Jeanette. And Morris, when you're ready.
Yes, so I hope you can hear me all right.
Yes.
Yes, so I want to put a spotlight on this initiative, the European Human Exposome Network. So next slide, please. Maybe a slide more. So what is it? In Europe, we recently have had a major granting round to invest massively in exposome research. So many of the topics we just had been presented before. And it's 9 projects amongst 24 countries and 126 research groups. And I think it's actually really a nice approach because basically each of these consortia consists of a lot of existing data sets that need to be harmonized and integrated together. And then the funding agency fortunately has taken this additional efforts to make us talk to each other, which I think is a great idea. And I'm leading an initiative within this network, which is called the Metadata Working Group. So basically the group trying to get the descriptions harmonized. So next slide. So this, again, I think, yes. So this is just an example of one of these projects. And I think in this group, it's probably very recognizable as that many of these projects try to study the impact of all kinds of environmental exposures, both inside and outside the body, to basically the development of the individual in terms of health and disease. So next slide. And I think the challenge of the network is that we need to harmonize all these different levels of information. So it's not only questionnaire data, but also all kinds of molecular data or environmental data measured maybe also on geolocations or imaging and so forth. So next slide. So in Europe, and I suppose that's the same across the world, We fortunately have many existing collections out there. So this is an example from one of these networks, where basically, a lot of data has been collected in the past decades. And the challenge for many of these projects is to retrospectively harmonize those. Exactly, I think like the previous speaker was giving examples thereof. So the task that we have is how to support that. So that's my role. My background is more in the infrastructure side of things. So next slide. So the idea is to support this process of identifying the variables. So this is really tailored towards research questions. So we basically try to identify what are the variables people are looking at. And one of the challenges I see as a computer scientist is that every researcher says that their study is very special, which is probably true. But as a consequence, we tend to harmonize to a large extent variables that for me as a computer scientist look fairly similar. So my dream would be is if we can bring these different initiatives together and make these activities comparable to each other. So there where possible, we can actually harmonize the harmonizers. So the process that you see here is basically the process we like to support. And in each of these 9 consortia, this happens. So define sort of the research variables for the research questions, then identifying what data actually exists in the sources, then evaluating to what extent the data actually can be mapped to these research variables, and then go through the whole process of harmonizing this data onto a common standard. And because of all kinds of privacy consideration, in many cases, the data is then not put in a central place, but is analyzed in a distributed fashion. So that's where we usually also need to invest in a sort of a federated analysis infrastructure. So next slide. So in the working group, we basically have a few spearheads in terms of topics we need to address. So the first thing that we would like to do is to create an integrated catalog of all this information. And this is a fairly early prototype. The good news is we're not the first one building these catalogs. So we're trying to basically integrate existing catalogs that we and others have been working on. But the idea is to basically make a catalog of the data banks, but more importantly also on the contents. So you have 2 levels here. The one is basically data collected, which is on the first layer. And then the second one is how are these data sets being integrated into collaborative networks, and what are they in the harmonized data models that are being used. So I can't believe that a lot of the ontology work we just discussed might be useful for here as well. So next slide. So what is in a catalog is basically has first the level of being able to identify. And these are 2 catalogs that we've been working on top of. So on the right, it's probably well known in the group. It's the Maelstrom catalog, which is a Canadian initiative. And on the left, it's a European initiative. It's the BBRA, that's the biobanking infrastructure of Europe. And this is the directory thereof. So next slide. And the idea is that we then also catalog the individual variables that people want to harmonize towards. So this is an example on how such a thing looks like. So on the left, you see basically a organization of all these variables by topic. And on the right, you see the definition of the variable. So this is the variable that people want to harmonize towards. So you could say this is the standard that people want to aim for. And if you then go to the next slide, and then we want to make a mapping between what data has been collected. So each row is here a data collection. Most of the cases a cohort study. And each of the columns is a variable. And then these tick boxes indicate to what extent data can be mapped between the data collected and the data that's necessary for the research. So next slide. And then for each of these mappings, you can sort of drill down and understand how a individual data has been collected. But you see on the left, these are the variables that are actually being collected inside of a study called ALSPAC. And then you can see on the also on how these variables are mapped. So I didn't show it, but you even can drill down to the algorithm that people have implemented to convert the data from their data collection to the harmonized variable, which is the thing on the right. Next slide. So then the other thing that we invest a lot in is try to enable this federated analysis to work. And we use a framework therefore called Data Shield. And the idea is then that each of the participating cohorts, which are illustrated by these blue boxes, have harmonized their data beforehand. And then researcher can send their analyses around and integrate the end results together. The next slide. And last but not least, a lot of time is actually lost by in the process of actually getting access to this data. So in parallel to all these semantic harmonization activities I just described before and the technical infrastructure to provide data access, we try to also harmonize the process of data access, or maybe data transfer in some cases. And the model that's often proposed there, and it's really the question to what extent local data banks are willing to do this, is that you have a central data access committee for the consortium as a whole. And then they basically say yes or no and give access to the central analysis environment that we have. And then before you get to the individual level data in the individual cohorts, you will also have an approval from the local data access provider. So next slide. So our strategy is to identify all these different data types, and this is maybe also the space that is most interested for this Birds of a Feather session. So we have a lot of topics identified in terms of data that needs harmonization, and we're looking to all kinds of initiatives to not reinvent the wheels. Next slide. And next to a human readable version, we also aim towards a more computer readable representation of this data. And in Europe, this fair data point methodology is really taking up. So it's one of the places we want to map to. And the nice thing is that if you would impose this on all the 9 participating consortia, you would be able to, if you click next slide, to also provide a human readable view of this data. So this is basically this fair data point. So next slide. Another principle that we have is that in order to demonstrate interoperability also on the implementation level, we try for everything that we do to have multiple implementers. So you can really demonstrate that the data is not locked up in one particular software, but that it actually can stream between different instances. Next slide. So this picture is basically to demonstrate that I think this is actually an overwhelming activity, to be honest. Because we have different of these networks. On the left top, you see this human exposome, European Human Exposome Network, which is already 9 projects. But what you now see happening is that you see overlap with other networks of networks. And I'm leading this You Can Connect project, which is one of the projects that's trying to build bridges between them. But of course, we are a tiny project, so we can never do this alone. So yeah, we really look forward to sort of connect the dots with other groups in the same space. Next slide. So concretely within the EHAN, we have identified a few priorities for the first year. We as a working group have started end last year and are now getting up to speed. So the first thing is to create this federated catalog where we start sharing the inventories of data between the different consortia. And we prioritize 2 areas of harmonization. So one is around omics data and the other is around urban exposures. And we are currently in the inventory phase. So it's actually maybe very timely to also join up with activities elsewhere. So I think that's my slide deck. Yep. Yes. This is just basically to not forget that many individuals have been involved in all of this. So I'm leading this little working group with 4 people. And each of these networks consists again of a few dozen people. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Morris. So we have a minute or 2 for any questions for the presenters. If you already have, I guess, Jessica, are there any questions in the Q&A?
Yes, there's one which might be relevant for a discussion later as well.
Okay. Is it directed to anybody in particular or just in general?
Charles, looks like you just unmuted yourself. Would you like to share?
Yeah, I can ask it. The last slide deck, was very interesting. I wasn't familiar that much with the European effort, but I'm wondering in terms of several of these efforts have essentially been developing catalogs of measurements being taken to standardized terms. That's not always embedded within ontologies, but tend to be, as far as I can tell, scattered around. I'm wondering if it looks like there's some efforts to build catalogs. I'm wondering whether people think that there's if it's worthwhile to spend some time as a group looking at and discussing different tools people are using, but also discussing how we can make those different catalogs interoperable. I know on our own side within NIEHS, we have our own catalog, and we're working with the EPA currently to discuss sharing of mappings with them. So I'm very curious to see what people think about whether we can do more sharing of these kinds of mappings and how we might do it and what tools people use.
Yeah, so I was just presenting. So yes, I would be very happy with that because within our project, we already try to separate the representation of the catalog contents from the software tools that we want to use, so that you can compete on sort of on the software, but can collaborate on the contents. And I think, yeah, if we could start to compare these, and let's see also Deborah making some nice points, we could indeed try to see whether we could make the representations of these catalogs interoperable properly. So yeah, count me in, I would say.
Maybe we'll just take that as an action item to send out an email later and see who's interested. Maybe we can, depending upon the size, we can either just have phone calls or some other kind of meeting.
We'll be sure to add that to our next steps as an outcome for this group. We have one more question out there, or I will move forward?
No, so far it's just responding to that.
Okay. Well, I hope everybody, the presentations have given you an appreciation for the challenges and subsequently then the opportunities for why we are proposing this interest group. And so now the remainder of the session will focus on our proposal for creating an EHS language interest group. And I'll briefly go over the sort of the road to us coming to RDA and briefly talk about the community model and the proposed charter, as well as a quick overview of some draft use cases that have been defined, and then we will launch into discussion and next steps. So how did we get here? Well, 2 previous workshops began addressing the challenges and needs in the environmental health sciences field, and were really productive in identifying some useful next steps. And we want to build on those activities and make sure we do so in a sustainable way. Both of those workshops were referenced on the program page with links to their respective articles, and that information has also been added to the Google Doc under a reading section. So hopefully you can learn more there. So this proposed community model is really being put forth as a straw man just to begin discussion. And the model begins with individuals or groups from discipline-specific communities generating use cases based on the research questions that are of interest to them. And those use cases represent needs for semantic solutions that will enhance the findability, sharing, and interoperability of EHS data. The use cases would be brought to the RDA Environmental Health Language Interest Group, and the IG will then provide a platform or a hub for overall coordination and collaboration among interested members. An RDA working group could be formed whenever a specific work product needs to be developed. So for example, if the product is an ontology, then ideally its development would follow the OBO Foundry framework in order for it to be interoperable with other ontologies. The IG and any working groups will then work in concert with relevant communities or partner organizations towards the development and implementation of the finalized recommendations and outputs. And then those products will be communicated back to the discipline-specific communities with the anticipation of adoption. Obviously, that's a very high-level overview of the model. And this example tries to explain how it could work in practice. As you've heard, we have we have quite a few siloed activities with some occasional coordinated group efforts, such as here. And the intent is to really create a place for those involved in semantic language work to share what they are doing, and better yet, work collaboratively towards developing community-driven solutions. So the example begins with an investigator, a data scientist, a curator, whoever has a use case that can benefit from a semantic solution. And these use cases then would serve to inform the overall goals and priorities for the EHS language interest group. At the stage of conceptualizing the use case, the hope is that the lead will at least bring it to the RDA interest group to raise awareness of the need, potentially tap into community expertise, and hopefully identify potential collaborators to work with. Depending upon the scope and the scale of the need, the investigator may choose to form a working group outside of RDA. The preference is that they would create an RDA working group in order to gain broader community input and perspectives. Whether those activities are done within or outside of RDA, the interest group can be there to support the working group's activities by offering time at the plenary sessions, offering guidance and expertise, as well as providing any other additional support that they might request. And then, of course, the developed products from a working group, we would love for those to be shared to the RDA interest group, as well as added to our resource clearinghouse. In addition, the RDA interest group can assist with disseminating and promoting adoption of the product if needed. So we propose the following mission and goals for the interest group. The purpose of the group is to advance integrative environmental health sciences research by developing and promoting adoption of a harmonized language, with the goals to define use cases for applying knowledge organization systems in research, foster community-based development of vocabularies, terminologies, and ontologies, promote and develop methods and tools for applying harmonized language, cultivate a vocabulary-aware environmental health community through training and education, and that would include advancing ontologists and semantic engineer positions as a career, and finally, and most importantly, adopt language standards and best practices for accurate environmental health data and knowledge representation. To achieve this mission, the interest group will undertake 3 key roles. The first would be a forum to identify, collect, and prioritize the use cases and define needs based on gaps. It would also be involved in coordinating activities and propose strategies and approaches to developing semantic solutions. Second, it would be a platform where interested parties can take those strategies and approaches and develop the solutions to address the identified use case needs, as well as promote the social elements such as incentives, metrics, etc., to support successful adoption and use of the standards. And then finally, the interest group would be a community of practice space for exchanging information, offering a resource clearinghouse, and fostering education and training. Some work has already started on identifying some high-level use case categories, along with very specific sub-use case examples that can benefit from the application of semantic language approaches. So as you see here, they start at the more, in air quotes, simple level of helping to facilitate finding information in terms of what data exists for a given chemical endpoint or exposure scenario. How can you combine data from multiple independent studies, so that interoperability? How can you identify given measures of biological response for one or more exposure? We also have what are the biomarkers and phenotypes or outcomes that can be measured using an indicator of exposure, all the way up to the more complex inferential types of questions, such as how can we predict possible health effects for a chemical or mixture based on a chemical structure or composition of a similar chemical. So after RDA, we want to keep the momentum going through a series of additional virtual events. The primary event in September is a 2-day workshop that will consist of 2 tracks. The first track will focus on build a sustainable community with the goal of achieving agreement on the community's mission and goals and development of a roadmap for the governance, outreach, and partnerships. The second track, develop solutions, will be an interactive workathon that's dedicated to initiating development of those semantic language solutions for specific use cases. To facilitate a productive discussion at the September workshop, NIEHS will host 2 pre-workshop events to help set the stage. The event in June is intended to provide attendees with the context for embarking on this community initiative and to lay the foundation for how the community can come together. The goal of the July workshop is to offer an introductory session on the different knowledge organization systems, especially ontologies, in terms of when to use them, where to find them, and how to apply them. So we invite you to participate, and please sign up on our email distribution list. There is a link to that in the Google Doc, and please share this initiative with others who you think may be interested. So I have a few next steps listed here to help prompt our discussion in terms of moving forward within the next 3 months or 6 months. And hopefully there is interest in us creating a interest group. So we would need to develop and submit the charter. I'm making a call out to see if there are others to volunteer to be a co-chair on the interest group. So per RDA, they require usually at least 3 to 4 chairs, and they need to also have a geographical representation so that this is not a EU-centric or a US-centric initiative, but a truly international community. We can begin selecting use cases and developing the packages of what's needed for those use cases. Obviously, we would love everybody to attend the upcoming events. And then in the next 6 months, actually, let me back up. So we have a bullet to add there with respect to the catalog question that was asked by Charles. And then in the 6 months, we can begin creating a repository of use cases as well as begin inventorying the data resources and databases and vocabulary resources that are relevant to the EHS field. I've lost my cursor here. Okay, here we go. So to summarize, the overarching purpose of this environmental health sciences language community and the proposed IG is to utilize harmonized data to connect knowledge and ultimately improve human health. So thank you, and please contact me if you're interested in participating in our IG. This has not been a solo effort. We have a program planning committee as well as a small group of community advisors. Thank you, Jeanette and Steve, who have been contributing to formulating the workshops and providing input on this community approach. So with that, I would like now to segue into our discussion period. So we have about 15 minutes remaining in the session, and I would love to be able to see everybody. So I'm going to now close out from presentation mode and see how this works, if I can still get the screen to share properly. Are you able to still see the discussion slide?
Yep.
Okay. I still can't see all of you. But okay, I think that's a PowerPoint challenge. Because if I go back over here, do you see me or do you see the PowerPoint slide?
We see the
We
videos of
see
everyone.
both.
You see both?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay,
Put-
as long as you're able to
Put
see
your
the.
camera on, Stephanie, then we can see you.
Okay, yes, all right, I guess, bye.
Yeah, perfect.
Hi, everyone. Okay, so we have, unfortunately now when I do this, in order to see Juno and to see everybody, I can't switch back over to the actual PowerPoint screen. So I think what I'm going to do is I just won't be able to see all of you. And I'm going to now, so here are the discussion questions that we have. And they are also included in the Google Doc. So hopefully you will continue to add to the discussion after the BoF session at the moment. But what we're really interested in is, first of all, is this an area, so of what you've heard, something that you would be interested in? You know, is this the type of field, an area that you would like to participate in? Or if you have any other initial thoughts, comments, or feedback on the proposed mission and goals and activities for the group. So if you, unfortunately, in the breakout sessions, they don't have hand raising. So maybe we can just, if you can kind of see who's waving their hands and then call on them.
Sure.
I don't know if that'll, I don't know how many people are attending, but so we'll open it up for discussion now.
We do have one question that came in through the Q&A, which is,
Great.
are you planning to interact or contribute to the vocabulary and semantic services group, which has a broader scope?
Yeah. So maybe that's Jan asking that question. It is. Hi, Jan. So that actually relates to our last question, is sort of what are some of the other existing RDA interest groups or working groups that would be worthwhile partners to collaborate with, and then how do we connect with them? And so definitely there are some cross-cutting and foundational efforts that already exist within RDA that we would want to interface with. And in fact, there was another RDA Birds of a Feather session earlier that I was listening in on that was sharing some mapping tools, right? So we were talking about how do we map vocabularies, and they were sharing some very interesting tools for that. So there's a lot going on in some of the other RDA efforts that we definitely would want to tap into that can help us with the technology piece, that can help us with some of those overarching kind of cross-cutting issues.
Stephanie, I have a technical suggestion. In the Google Doc, there are 22 people that signed in. And I think there are some more people that are commenting in the chat. So if you're interested to be part of the initiative, maybe you can go back to the document and add your credentials, add your contact details. And because half of the people that are on this list are from NHS or directly connected to the initiative. So it would be good to get new people.
Thanks, Maria. Yes, I'm unfortunately unable to go into it, so I appreciate your checking. So if you definitely are interested in keeping in touch, and please go ahead and add your contact information on the sheet, as well as also subscribe to the listserv link that is also included on the Google Doc. So are there any other initial comments or feedback or thoughts with respect to the mission and goals and proposed activities? I think for the most part, they align with what RDA groups typically end up doing, but more specifically, what would be important as those first steps for the environmental health science field? Are there any changes you would make to the goals or anything that you think would be worth adding in? I can go to those were the goals that were there.
I know I talked already, but I just like to reiterate Charles's point about just knowing what other people are doing and having that be shared, because that idea of creating these use cases and seeing the gaps, it's quite possible that we have a gap that someone else has filled and we just don't know. So I really do think that, I mean, being able to see what's going on in Europe was just so cool. And so I really think that having more of that would be really helpful.
The list of use cases and gaps can become one of the outputs, work group, IG, interest group outputs, RDA outputs that will be posted in conjunctions with the group activity.
And these were the activities. Is there anything that resonates here with the attendees? Anything that other areas of activity that we could be considering for our interest group?
I apologize for my ignorance on how RDA works, but with something like a BoF, do we take a poll at the end, seeing if people are actually interested in the idea, or how do we actually judge?
Well, I don't have the capability of doing a poll on the fly, unfortunately. I think, so typically if there is enough expression of interest, and we can add that to the Google Doc actually. So maybe Jess, if you can put a section at the top of the Google Doc saying, you know, would you be interested in joining an EHS language interest group, and allow people to, or maybe flag it, actually, maybe flag that next to the attendee list.
Yeah.
Putting a column there that said, yes, I would be interested in joining an EHS language IG, and then people can mark yes if they're interested. I think that would be a good way of doing that.
Yeah, the Google Doc is more permanent, but there is a poll in the Juno thing.
Well, but I'm adding the column in the Google Doc, interested in joining IG. And so people can just put X next to their name.
Thanks, Maria. Yeah, unfortunately, that poll needed to be set up before.
Okay.
You can't
I thought that was going to be easy.
Yeah, that would be too easy.
I see.
Yeah.
Stephanie, there was a question that came in from Michelle about how would we coordinate or get the word out and input on EHS language outside of RDA and NIEHS?
Well, that just requires a lot of marketing and outreach. It requires trying to identify who a lot of those other interested stakeholders may be that are working in this space. And, you know, by we, I mean those among us of the program planning committee have been trying to identify additional groups that we want to make sure we reach out to. There's a variety of other communities that have overlap with ours, you know, either slightly tangentially or significant overlap. You know, there's the Earth Sciences Information Partnership, which also has recently launched an initiative within RDA. There's the agricultural community that has some interesting overlap with us as well. Obviously, as you heard from Bill, there's the climate change and geospatial communities that would be interested. We have our ecotox communities as well. So there is a very expansive range of stakeholders. And I think a lot of it will we can, just like when thinking about developing an ontology or vocabulary, right? I mean, when Dewey started the classification system, do you start with the big world, right? Which can be very unwielding, and you never know whether or not it's going to meet a need, or do you try to start small and take a piece that's a little bit more achievable and then build out from there. And so I think part of the effort will be driven by those use cases, right? Who are the people who are interested in this and want to come to the table? And they will represent specific communities, whether it's exposome, whether it's risk assessment or environmental epidemiology, or whatever those communities may be. Whoever wants to come to that table, we will work then to try to expand out to the stakeholders that need to be aware to help address those specific use cases. At least that's what I'm proposing. I mean, we want this to be a community-driven effort, and for people to be deciding what is our best way for creating and defining what this community will be and how it will work.
On a very practical level, I think it's pretty common that output of RDA working group is formulated as a white paper. So you put together a set of recommendations and best practices and just publish it.
Right, for the interest groups, yes. And then if there is a need to actually develop something very specific, whether it's an ontology or a tool or some form of a workflow or whatever it might be, then those work products from the working group, literally are more tangible products.
This is Gwen. I have a little sort of bit of trouble appreciating the whole totally volunteer idea. I think we need to think about volunteer, but also maybe some targeted invitations with encouragement for people who are perhaps part of other RDA working groups where we think we need their expertise in order to get people interested in our area, as well as people outside of RDA to encourage them to become part of an RDA activity. Because, I could see how sending blasts out to our various communities may not resonate with people who are super busy, who feel like they already have what they need for their own research in the moment. And what we're trying to do is build something that's bigger than a particular research team in the moment for the longer term and the benefit of the field. So a combination of, anybody who'd like to come, of course, we would never turn anybody away, but figuring out how to make some targeted invitations and encouraging those people to take an active role in the group.
Very relevant point, Gwen. Yes, I totally agree that we will need to have a more targeted outreach for those researchers or informaticians that we can learn from and that we would want to be part of the effort.
Can I just say, I totally agree with what Gwen just said, Bill. I was looking on, before I got invited to this workshop, I had never actually heard of RDA. I didn't know what it was. And when you're asking about voting or supporting an interest group in RDA, to me, a question is, am I even able to have a say? Because I'm not part of RDA. I don't see myself being part of it. And when I look at the membership, which is on the RDA website, in places where I work, like Peru, Ecuador, Brazil, there are maybe 6 people from each country that are part of RDA. And so I think that if you really want to create a kind of a more inclusive approach to merging data and harmonizing data, I totally agree that you need some very targeted invitations to people who are outside of the network already.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we recognize that vast majority of the environmental health sciences community is likely not familiar with the Research Data Alliance, and that there would need to be some level of awareness raising and education about that. At the moment, to become a member of RDA, for individuals, there is no membership fee. Whether or not that will change as part of their new strategic plan, I don't know, but that has always been, I guess, their way of encouraging participation by limiting, by not limiting, I should say, participation, because people don't have to worry about paying a membership fee. So anybody it's really a totally community-driven, grassroots type of organization where if you come together because you're interested in collaborating and coordinating around a shared goal and working towards creating some form of a product. And so your voice is heard if you're willing and interested in participating and being at the table. And then the hope, of course, then is that the more we can get people at least willing to just come and listen, right, and get more awareness raising around this, we can eventually get to that whole adoption and implementation stage. And it seems like there's so much work that needs to be done in the environmental health space. I mean, we have a lot of really worthwhile pockets here and there, but our community is still at its sort of foundling stage in terms of thinking about this overall. So we are at our time. We're at 12:32. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. It's been a long hour and a half, I'm sure, for some of you, over lunchtime for some. But really appreciate your attending our session. Please make sure to go to our Google Doc and add your name to the attendee list and indicate if you would be interested in attending and being a participant in our EHS Language Interest Group. And please sign up for our email distribution list, as well as be on the lookout for our upcoming workshops. And there is a link to that as well in the Google Doc. It's not active yet. It won't be active until the beginning of May, but at least you have the link that you can go to and check on it when it does become live. So thank you, everybody. Really appreciate your time and look forward to your participation. Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye,
Stephanie.
everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.